In the summer of 1941, the map of Europe was being redrawn at speed and at gunpoint. Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on 22 June under the code name Operation Barbarossa, was not just a military campaign. It was a political project aimed at annihilation, colonization, and the destruction of the Soviet state. Nowhere did that project collide more violently with geography, symbolism, and human endurance than at Leningrad. The city that had once been St. Petersburg, capital of the old empire, then Petrograd of revolution, and finally Leningrad of Soviet identity, became a target not only because it was a major industrial and naval center, but because it was a trophy. Hitler wanted it erased, not occupied. The siege that followed became one of the longest and deadliest in modern history. Breaking it was not a single heroic moment, but a grinding sequence of decisions, offensives, supply improvisations, and brutal attrition. The Red Army did not simply lift the siege. It learned, at catastrophic cost, how to fight a modern war under conditions designed to kill a city by starvation. When German forces crossed the Soviet border in June 1941, Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb drove through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Their advance was rapid, aided by surprise, Luftwaffe air superiority, and the early disarray of Soviet command. By July, German troops were already approaching the Luga defensive line south of the city. At the same time, Finland, co-belligerent with Germany in what Finns called the Continuation War, moved to regain territory lost in the Winter War of 1939–1940. Finnish forces advanced on the Karelian Isthmus and toward Lake Ladoga, tightening the strategic vice. From the start, the threat to Leningrad was not only from the south and west, but also from the north, and that mattered because it constrained Soviet options. The city could not simply be evacuated or abandoned without enormous political and military consequences. Leningrad was a symbol of the 1917 revolution, a major armaments producer, and the base of the Baltic Fleet. If it fell, the psychological shock would reverberate across the USSR, and the Germans would gain a powerful position on the northern flank. The Soviet response was shaped by a leadership culture that demanded defense at all costs and punished retreat, sometimes regardless of tactical reality. In July and August, the Soviets threw together defensive positions, mobilized workers' militias, and formed new units under the pressure of encirclement. The Leningrad Front was created, and the city's defense became a combined effort of regular troops, NKVD units, sailors, and civilian volunteers. Yet the strategic situation deteriorated. On 8 September 1941, German forces captured Schlisselburg on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, cutting the last land connection to the city. That date is widely marked as the beginning of the siege. Leningrad was now isolated from the rest of the Soviet Union by land, with German and Finnish forces forming a ring that was not always continuous in the sense of a trench line everywhere, but was effective enough to prevent normal supply. The city still had access across Lake Ladoga, but that lifeline depended on weather, shipping capacity, enemy air attack, and the ability of Soviet logistics to improvise under fire. The German plan for Leningrad was explicit in its cruelty. Hitler and the German High Command did not intend to storm the city at the cost of heavy infantry casualties as they had done in earlier campaigns. They intended to starve it. Directives and later testimony show a policy of refusing surrender terms and planning to level the city with artillery and air power while preventing civilians from escaping. The siege was therefore not just a military blockade, it was a weapon of mass death. The Luftwaffe bombed food warehouses, rail yards, and power stations. Artillery and aerial bombardment became a daily fact of life, but hunger was the main killer. Food stocks were insufficient for a city of over 2 million people, swollen by refugees. Rationing began and then tightened. By November 1941, bread rations fell to catastrophic levels. For many civilians, 125 grams per day. For workers, 250 grams. The bread itself was often adulterated with fillers. The winter of 1941–1942 was one of the coldest in memory. Fuel ran out. Public transport stopped. Water pipes froze. People burned furniture and books to heat rooms. The death toll soared. Documented estimates vary, but the number of civilians who died during the siege is commonly placed around 1 million, with the worst mortality concentrated in that first winter. Inside the city, Soviet authorities faced an impossible equation: hold the front lines, keep essential industry running, maintain order, and prevent collapse, all while the population starved. The political stakes were enormous. Leningrad's party leadership, including Andrei Zhdanov, became central to the defense narrative and to Stalin's management of the crisis. The NKVD enforced discipline and fought panic and looting. Factories were reorganized for war production even under bombardment. The Baltic Fleet's guns supported the defense. Sailors were formed into infantry brigades. The city's survival became a test case for Soviet mobilization, propaganda, and coercion under extreme conditions. Yet none of that changed the strategic reality. Without a supply corridor, Leningrad would die. The only viable route was across Lake Ladoga, the vast body of water east of the city. In autumn 1941, supplies moved by barge and boat under air attack. When winter froze the lake, a new lifeline emerged, an ice road. It became known as the Road of Life, the Doroga Zhizny. Trucks drove across the frozen surface, carrying flour, ammunition, and fuel into the city and evacuating civilians, especially children, on the return trip. The route was perilous. Ice thickness varied. Vehicles broke through. German aircraft and artillery targeted the convoys, yet the Road of Life kept Leningrad from immediate extinction. It did not provide abundance. It provided survival. The volume of supplies was never enough to restore normal life, but it stabilized the situation enough for the Soviet command to plan something more ambitious: breaking the siege by force. The first attempts to relieve Leningrad were costly and largely unsuccessful. In late 1941 and early 1942, Soviet offensives around the Volkhov River and toward Lyuben aimed to break through to the city. The terrain, forests, swamps, and rivers favored defense and punished poorly coordinated attacks. The Red Army at this stage was still recovering from the shock of Barbarossa. It suffered from inexperienced commanders, shortages of radios and transport, and the brutal learning curve of combined arms warfare. One of the most tragic episodes was the fate of the Second Shock Army during the Lyuben offensive operation in early 1942. Committed to a breakthrough, it advanced into difficult terrain and became overextended. German counterattacks and encirclement followed. The army was effectively destroyed, and its commander, General Andrei Vlasov, was captured in July 1942, later becoming infamous for collaborating with the Germans. The disaster underscored a hard truth: breaking the siege would require not only courage but operational competence, massed artillery, better coordination between fronts, and reliable logistics. Even as these offensives failed, the front stabilized. The Germans did not take Leningrad, but they maintained the blockade. In 1942, the city endured another year of deprivation, though conditions were somewhat less catastrophic than the first winter due to improved supply management and continued Ladoga transport. Meanwhile, the broader war began to shift. The German failure before Moscow in December 1941 showed that the Soviet Union would not collapse quickly. By late 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad was consuming German resources and attention. Soviet industry, much of it evacuated eastward in 1941, was now producing tanks, guns, and aircraft in enormous quantities. The Red Army's command structure was learning, painfully, to plan large-scale operations with artillery preparation, deception, and reserves. These changes mattered for Leningrad because they created the conditions for a deliberate, well-supported attempt to open a land corridor. The breakthrough came in January 1943 with Operation Iskra, meaning spark. It was not the final lifting of the siege, but it was the turning point that transformed Leningrad's situation from slow death to hard survival with a chance of recovery. The plan was shaped by the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, and executed by two fronts: the Leningrad Front under General Leonid Govorov and the Volkhov Front under General Kirill Meretskov. The objective was to strike the narrow German-held corridor south of Lake Ladoga, particularly around the town of Schlisselburg and the Siniavino Heights. This area was crucial because it was the choke point between Leningrad and the rest of Soviet-held territory. If the Soviets could cut through even a few kilometers, they could build a rail line and road to supply the city. On 12 January 1943, the offensive began with massive artillery preparation. The Red Army had learned to concentrate firepower, and the opening bombardment was intended to crush German strongpoints and allow infantry to advance. The Germans, primarily elements of the 18th Army under General Georg Lindemann, had fortified the area heavily. The fighting was brutal, close range, and costly. Soviet troops attacked through snow and forest, against minefields and machine gun nests. The Neva River crossings were particularly deadly, yet this time the Soviet assault did not collapse into chaos. Both fronts pushed toward each other, narrowing the gap. On 18 January 1943, Soviet forces linked up near the settlement of Workers' Settlement No. 1 and No. 5, effectively opening a corridor along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. Shlisselburg was liberated the same day. The corridor was now often described as 8 to 10 kilometers wide, but it was land. It meant the siege was broken in a technical sense. Leningrad was no longer completely cut off. The consequences were immediate and strategic. The Soviets began constructing a railway line through the corridor under enemy fire. This line, sometimes called the Victory Road, was completed with astonishing speed in early 1943. Trains began bringing in larger quantities of food and ammunition than the Ladoga route alone could provide. The Germans continued to shell the corridor, and the city remained within artillery range, but the logistical balance shifted. Rations improved. Evacuation became more systematic. The city's defense became more sustainable. Operation Iskra did not push the Germans far enough to end bombardment or remove the threat, but it ensured that Leningrad would not starve to death. It also signaled a broader change in the war. The Red Army was now capable of planning and executing coordinated operations that achieved concrete strategic goals. Still, the siege continued. Through 1943, the front around Leningrad remained active, with further Soviet efforts to expand the corridor and push German forces back from artillery range. Fighting around Mga and the Sinyavino Heights continued, and the Germans fought stubbornly. Leningrad was not yet safe. The city's civilians were still living under shelling, with infrastructure damaged and the scars of famine everywhere. Yet the strategic initiative was shifting. German forces were increasingly stretched. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht faced the loss of experienced troops and the need to defend a vast front. In July 1943, the Battle of Kursk ended Germany's last major strategic offensive in the east. From then on, the Red Army's pressure became relentless. That pressure would eventually reach the Leningrad sector with decisive force. The final lifting of the siege came in January 1944, in what Soviet history calls the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. By then, the Red Army had accumulated strength, improved its operational art, and could coordinate multiple fronts with artillery, armor, infantry, and air support. The Leningrad front under Govorov and the Volkhov front under Meretskov were again central, supported by the Second Baltic Front under General Markian Popov. The objective was no longer a narrow corridor. It was to shatter Army Group North's positions, push German artillery out of range, and restore Soviet control over key rail and road networks in the region. The offensive began on 14 January 1944. Soviet forces struck from the Oranienbaum bridgehead west of Leningrad and from positions south of the city. The Oranienbaum bridgehead itself was a symbol of endurance, a Soviet-held pocket on the Gulf of Finland that had survived since 1941, supplied by sea and defended under constant threat. In January 1944, it became a launch pad for a major attack. The Soviets used overwhelming artillery preparation and massed forces to break German defensive lines. German units, already weakened and lacking reserves, began to retreat. The Soviet advance was not effortless. The Germans conducted delaying actions and used strongpoints, but the scale of Soviet pressure was now too great. On 20 January 1944, Soviet troops liberated Novgorod, a city of deep historical significance that had been occupied since 1941 and heavily damaged. The liberation was both symbolic and operational. It disrupted German positions and threatened their lines of communication. Meanwhile, German forces pulled back from the immediate vicinity of Leningrad. On 27 January 1944, the Soviet authorities declared that the siege of Leningrad had been fully lifted. That date became one of the city's most important commemorations. Fireworks were launched in celebration, a dramatic reversal after nearly 900 days of darkness, hunger, and bombardment. The number 900 days is often used as a shorthand, though the exact duration from 8 September 1941 to 27 January 1944 is 872 days. The difference matters to historians, but the larger truth remains. This was a siege measured not only in days, but in the scale of human loss and endurance. The lifting of the siege did not mean the end of fighting in the region. The Soviet advance continued westward in early 1944, pushing German forces toward the Baltic states. Army Group North would later be trapped in the Kurland pocket, holding out until the end of the war in May 1945. But for Leningrad, the strategic nightmare had ended. The city could rebuild supply lines, restore power and transport, and begin the slow process of recovery. Yet recovery was not simply physical. The siege left a demographic wound. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Entire families disappeared. The cultural and psychological trauma was profound. Diaries like that of Tanya Savisheva, a young girl whose brief entries recorded the deaths of her family members, became emblematic of the siege's human cost. The city's survival became a cornerstone of Soviet wartime identity, used in propaganda and later memorialization as proof of resilience and sacrifice. To understand how the Red Army broke the siege, it is necessary to see the siege not as an isolated tragedy, but as a strategic contest shaped by ideology, logistics, and operational learning. Germany's decision to starve Leningrad rather than storm was rooted in Nazi policy toward the Soviet population and in the Wehrmacht's calculation of costs. It also reflected Hitler's fixation on symbolic targets and his willingness to commit mass murder as strategy. For the Soviets, the decision to hold Leningrad was equally political and strategic. Abandoning the city would have freed German forces for other fronts, threatened the Baltic Fleet, and delivered a massive propaganda victory to the enemy. Holding it forced the Germans to commit troops and artillery to a prolonged siege, tying down resources that could not be used elsewhere. But this came at a terrible price, paid overwhelmingly by civilians. The Red Army's eventual success was built on several interlocking factors. The first was sheer endurance under conditions designed to break it. The defenders maintained a perimeter, sometimes only kilometers from the city center, through the worst winter and under constant fire. The second was improvisation in logistics, particularly the road of life across Lake Ladoga. Without that route, the city likely would have collapsed in early 1942. The third was the maturation of Soviet operational planning. Early relief attempts failed in part because the Red Army lacked coordination, suffered from insufficient artillery preparation, and underestimated German defensive capacity in difficult terrain. By 1943, in Operation Iskra, the Soviets concentrated forces on a narrow sector, coordinated two fronts, and achieved a realistic objective, opening a corridor rather than attempting an immediate, sweeping liberation. The corridor changed everything by allowing rail supply. Finally, by 1944, the Red Army had the mass and experience to conduct a large offensive that forced the Germans to retreat significantly, ending the siege in practice, not just on paper. The German side of the equation also changed. Army Group North was never the main focus of German strategic effort after 1941. As the war turned against Germany, reinforcements went to more critical sectors. The Germans maintained strong defenses around Leningrad, but they lacked the strength to both hold the line and respond flexibly to Soviet offensives across the entire Eastern Front. The attrition of experienced troops, the increasing effectiveness of Soviet artillery and air power, and the cumulative strain of a multi-front war weakened their ability to sustain the siege indefinitely. The siege ended not because the Germans suddenly lost interest, but because they could no longer afford to hold those positions against a Soviet army that had learned how to break fortified lines. The consequences of lifting the siege were immediate for the war effort and long-term for Soviet society. Militarily, it secured the northern flank, protected the approaches to the Baltic, and freed Soviet forces for further operations in 1944. Politically, it became a narrative of heroic resistance that the Soviet state used to unify the population and legitimize its leadership. The city of Leningrad was later awarded the title of Hero City, and the siege became central to Soviet remembrance of the Great Patriotic War. Yet the memory was also managed. Discussions of the full scale of suffering, the failures of preparation, and the harshness of internal discipline were often constrained by official narratives that emphasized unity and heroism over controversy. The siege also left a legacy that extends beyond wartime history into the modern world. Leningrad's ordeal is a case study in how cities become strategic objects and civilian populations become targets when warfare is driven by ideology and totalizing goals. It shows how starvation can be weaponized and how survival can depend on logistics as much as on battlefield victories. It also demonstrates how states construct memory, how a catastrophe is transformed into a symbol, and how that symbol shapes identity for generations. Today, when modern conflicts again place cities under siege, bombardment, or blockade, the story of Leningrad remains a warning and a lens. The Red Army broke the siege through a combination of endurance, adaptation, and overwhelming force applied at the right point in time. But the deeper takeaway is more unsettling. The siege was possible because political decisions on both sides treated a city of millions as an instrument of strategy. Leningrad survived, and the siege ended on 27 January 1944, but the human cost of those 872 days became part of the 20th century's permanent recorder reminder that in total war, victory and tragedy can be inseparable, and that the line between military necessity and mass suffering is often drawn by those far from the front.